What I wanted to talk to you today about extreme aggression is the culmination of really about 30 years of professional experiences that I've had with a variety of individuals who we could characterize as interesting. And so, what I wanted to provide is really a panoramic look at extreme types of aggressive behavior and criminal behavior. And these are primarily people who would be at the extreme right tail of the offending distribution. And so it's likely that you haven't been exposed to some of these individuals because they're very difficult to sample and very difficult to access unless you're working with the criminal justice system. To give you some background, in terms of my work experiences, they're relatively unique and have allowed me to have a considerable amount of connection to criminal defendants and correctional clients of a variety of sorts. So in addition to my research and teaching at Iowa State University, I previously worked as a pretrial services officer in Colorado and interviewed several thousand criminal defendants during that time. And those individuals ranged from normatively behaved people who had no aggression history and just happened to get arrested, all the way through to people who had hundreds of arrests and who were profoundly antisocial throughout life. More recently, I worked as a research specialist with the United States Probation and Pretrial Services in the Southern District of Iowa. And during that tenure, I had a number of research projects dealing with individuals convicted of sexual offenses. And also, I had the opportunity to perform psychopathy assessments on some of their more challenging clients to provide information to inform officer safety. Over the last 20 years or so, I've served as a consultant and an expert witness in a variety of cases in both the criminal and civil side. And disproportionately, my consulting activities involve homicide offenders. And in some of these cases, these are capital murder cases in which the defendant could potentially be sentenced to death. The last development in my career, and one that I'm sort of ongoing, is I've tried to incorporate my academic and scholarly understanding of antisocial behavior, aggression, and violence, and connecting that with the true crime genre, which is one of the largest sociocultural genres in the United States. And I kind of call it true crime criminology. And so I want to talk about those three books at the very end of the presentation today, just to give you a sense of where my research is going. The first substantive area that I was interested in was what we call career criminals. And although that's a very recognizable, intuitive idea, the science about career criminals is even more impressive. And for over a half century, we've known that about 5% of the offender population accounts for more than half of the crime in that population. And when you start to delve inside the violent felonies of murder, rape, armed robbery, aggravated assault, that 5% group is even more disproportionately responsible. So from a policy perspective and from a prevention perspective, this group is very attractive because if we can prevent them from developing, we're going to preclude a great amount of criminal suffering. And if we can successfully identify and incapacitate them, we're going to enhance public safety. As I progressed in my career, invariably career criminality is going to overlap with other content areas in the social and forensic sciences. It has strong convergent validity with psychopathy, with different kinds of homicide typologies, with prison gangs or security threat groups, and with gangs. And across these literatures, for many, aggression becomes a life script in which they almost gratuitously employ violence for its own sake. And some of the examples that I'll give you today are almost, they seem too severe to be real, but they are. And it's interesting because it accents some of the aggression literature and what we know about it, but it also provides some interesting challenges in understanding how different kinds of psychological factors, how different kinds of sociological factors relate to the expression of aggression in its extreme forms. Across these literatures and throughout my professional experiences, I've encountered individuals who had significant homicidal ideation. And one of the points that I want you to sort of think about is the difference between an episodic type of homicidal ideation and those who experience it on a daily basis throughout life and who earnestly think about perpetrating lethal violence. And to give you some examples, an individual, I did not meet him, but I have research access to his records. This is a person who was death sentenced in California. He died on death row, so he's no longer with us. But during court proceedings, he told the judge, "Some people are salvageable, you know, I'm not." And I always found that quotation striking because during forensic interviews with some of these individuals, they have a surprisingly astute amount of insight about their behavior and how different it is than conventional people or people who are lesser types of criminal offenders. And sometimes they'll go off script, so to speak. They'll relax some of their manipulative tendencies, and they will be very earnest with me about what their life has been like, how aggression and violence has harmed them, how in some cases they felt that it's facilitated their life. It's a very interesting rift to hear people talk about violence who use violence all the time. This individual was condemned for 2 murders. He confessed to 6, and he had lifelong conduct problems beginning in very early childhood. In my career, the earliest antisocial onset that I've ever seen was a person who was contacted by police at age 2 years, 10 months. He had eloped from home and was playing with gasoline and matches, and the police contacted him and found him and brought him back. Decades later, perhaps unsurprisingly, he was arrested and convicted of multiple arson offenses. In this California case for the capital crimes, the person brutalized a young married couple, torturing, physically abusing them, robbing them, and sexually assaulting both the husband and the wife. And so the extremity of his case profile kind of gives you a sense of the types of behaviors that some of these individuals are engaging in who end up at the very end stages of the justice system. If I were to poll the people in the audience today and ask how many of you have ever uttered the phrase, "I could have killed so-and-so," the prevalence is probably 100%. But we know that for most people, saying, "Oh, I could have killed so-and-so," is an entirely intellectual and meaningless statement that has no forensic value. But for others, talking about contemplating homicide is a significant psychological and behavioral problem. And in a number of data sources, I've seen that particularly defendants who have more frequent, serious, and chronic contemplation of murder, it significantly predicts homicide perpetration, which perhaps is tautological. But the other part that I want you to think about is that homicidal ideation predicts really all other forms of aggression as well, along with criminal career severity. And so it seems to be almost a rocket fuel, so to speak, for these individuals who are constantly thinking about ways that they can use aggression to further not only their criminal career, but to respond to disputes in everyday life. In a national data file of several million who have been in the emergency departments in the United States, you can see that different kinds of psychopathology are significantly associated with increased likelihood of homicidal ideation. And so, for instance, antisocial personality disorder increases the odds by over 2,000%. Other cluster A and B personality disorders do as well, as do psychotic disorders. And so when we see an individual in the news, for instance, or in the media, who has evidence of significant homicidal ideation, the forensic and criminological import of that really can't be overstated. And I encourage criminologists and social scientists to study homicidal ideation to a much greater degree than they have yet today. For those who experience it often, and for instance, when I worked at the jail all those years ago, we had an older man, roughly at the time I was in my 20s, so I call him older, but he was, let's say, around 60 years of age. And during the dress-in part where he was going to be taken into intake, they do a pretty cursory mental health screen, and he was doing fine. But one of the questions was, are you thinking about harming or killing anyone? And without any kind of irony, his reaction was, not any more than usual. And I always was struck by the matter-of-factness with which he said that. But if you look across different kinds of homicide typologies in terms of especially mass murderers and sexual homicide offenders, homicidal ideation plays out in somewhat different ways. In mass murderers, especially school shooters, you see individuals who really ruminate in their homicidal thoughts, and it's part and parcel of a very dark, dysphoric inner emotional life, high levels of persecution, lots of grievance, real and perceived. And for them, homicide becomes a behavioral option that can rectify their social standing relative to other people. In cases of security threat group members or prison gang members, homicide ideation is frankly the operating principle upon which they serve their time in custody. And so if you look at their misconduct records, there's very high levels of weapons manufacturing in use, attacks of other inmates, attacks of correctional staff, and also inmate murders. In sexual homicide, homicidal ideation is a very powerful driving force. And that quotation that is there at the bottom, the need, the thought, the feeling, the excitement of harming, getting some sort of sexual gratification and harming someone was absolutely paramount. That was a statement uttered by Ted Bundy, who is believed to have at minimum murdered 30 women. And as I'll talk about later in the presentation, the evidence is there that it likely was exponentially higher than that. Keeping with the security threat group members in my consulting work in the last several years, I've dealt with a number of cases where individuals who are involved in the Mexican Mafia or the Aryan Brotherhood, and a few other security threat groups, but those two in particular, already serving life sentences, nevertheless kill another prisoner while in custody. And the instrumentality of their aggression, not only as a security threat group member, but as a significant and substantial psychopathic person, is really quite shocking. And just to give you an anecdote, one of the individuals who was not sentenced to death, he received a life sentence. He was disappointed because he wanted to be placed on death row so that he could perform murder hits for the gang. In other cases in California, for instance, individuals on death row in both the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood, who were themselves inmate murderers, have been killed while on death row for some perceived violation of prison gang rules. And so it gives you a sense of how profoundly entrenched this instrumental aggression is, even when individuals are serving very lengthy prison terms and or death sentences. In some of the prison murder cases that I've worked, the level of violence, the word extreme doesn't do it justice. And so, for instance, one of the cases involved an individual who murdered a gang fellow in the Mexican Mafia, and the actual killing took roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes. But then over a period of around 45 minutes, the individual would return to the body to engage in a variety of other violent acts against the body. And so for those of you who are true crime enthusiasts, especially if you read about serial homicide or sexual homicide, you'll often see post-mortem behaviors, usually of a necrophilic sort. In this case, you saw post-mortem overkill and just a joy of engaging in violent acts over an individual who was deceased. And in some respects, the body language of the perpetrator was such that they appeared to be disappointed that the person died, the victim died so quickly or easily. They wanted the violence to go on for a longer period of time. And so that middle quotation in one case that I've worked, we're talking about a prison murder. The person says, I'm not saying I liked it, but there was a relief or a sense of relief afterward. Yeah, I kind of liked it. And so that's an example of a person providing you with information where they're telling you diametric answers. But one of the interesting experiences I've had in some of these forensic interviews is talking to some of these offenders in a way that really allows them to engage their psychopathic and antisocial personality features and to talk to me in a way where they can tell that I'm not being judgmental. And so let me give you an example that I sometimes tell my students. In some of these interviews that I've done, I'll ask a person, how long were you in that facility before you had to stab someone? And my students will look at me and I'll say, what's interesting about that question? If I had asked them, have you ever stabbed anyone? Their answer would be no. So there's a high level of deception and a tremendous amount of minimization on the part of these offenders. But if I just simply ask them a question in a way where it seems as if I'm endorsing the behavior, or at least acknowledging that it has to occur, it really tends to relax the interviewee and allows them to talk to me in a much more forthright and honest way than they maybe were going to otherwise. It's also a bizarre experience for me as the interviewer to almost adopt these antisocial features in some of my questioning to elicit information. One individual who I'm going to talk about at length here in a bit, as we were beginning the interview, he was taking off his coat. It was during winter, and he was hanging his coat up, and he said, I suppose you want to talk about all of the prison murders. And I said, yes, we'll talk about that and a lot of features of your life. And he looked at me with a glint in his eye and said, well, only the strong survive. And so it was also a chilling example of the homicidality that some of these individuals have. And when they do display emotion, it's often inappropriate. So for that interviewee in particular, by his own estimation, he experienced effectively no emotion until he was about 65 years of age. But during our conversation, when he would present a little bit of positive emotion, it was in an inappropriate context connected to some kind of emotion, or excuse me, a violent situation. This was an individual who has a remarkable criminal history, who was effectively confined almost continuously from 1957 until 2012. And an early starting career offender. He ultimately served 40 years in custody at the state level. And one of the unique things about his offending history is he would recurrently escape from prison. And when he did, he would go on armed bank robbery sprees. And so he was simultaneously, for much of his life, both a state and a federal correctional client. During his time in custody, both the state and federal level, he was involved in roughly 10 to 15 murders that he either perpetrated, co-perpetrated, or ordered. And during one forensic interview with him, we had about a 2-hour conversation. He started to describe one of these attacks. And in doing so, he made a fist and started to stab or simulate stabbing himself all about his torso and legs, and basically recreating that event for me. And that went on for roughly 1 minute. And at the end of it, I asked him if that stabbing had been fatal. And he kind of got that wry smile, glint in his eye, and said, no, I guess I didn't get him in the heart. But it's a vivid example of the matter-of-factness with which these individuals engaged in violent crime and engaged in murder, and did so in such a emotionalist way. And particularly in that interview, and I've had it in a few others, all of these individuals are significantly psychopathic. I think this gentleman was either a 35 or 36 on the PCLR. But what I've experienced is that their affective deficits are so profound, it overtakes their interpersonal style. And what I don't see in many of these cases is this sort of slick, glib, superficial charm, interpersonal features that you would see in a Ted Bundy type of offender. In my experience, they are disturbingly honest and methodical in their description of their violence, particularly if it seems we've had pretty good rapport. And so although there is a significant amount of minimization and a significant amount of lying by omission and a significant amount of deception, there's also nevertheless some spontaneous utterances that they make that convince me they are true. And with this interviewee in particular, some of the statements that he made and the claims that he made, which seemed rather outlandish during the interview, I corroborated with records about a year or so afterward. And so it's an interesting thing in talking with a psychopathic offender where they are being honest and not being deceptive and are just simply giving you the information that you might want. And sometimes giving you information that you would have no idea that they were going to produce. In terms of prison aggression, to kind of link you back to the first slide about career criminals, in the community, that small cadre of offenders is committing the bulk of the problems. The exact same dynamic exists in custody. And so these are some colleagues' data using national prisoner data from US facilities. And you can see that 1% of prisoners in the United States account for more than a third of the misconduct. And you can also see that a significant proportion of correctional clients fare well while they're in custody and are at minimal risk. One of the interviewees I talked with, whose criminal career was extensive but not extreme, I asked him about his different times in different federal facilities. And one of the things he said to me was that most of the placements he's had, he felt were fine and that living there was fine, with the exception of ones where there was a significant gang presence. And I asked, well, what was the issue there? And he said, well, there's the safety issue, but he got tired of them disrupting the order of the facility so often. And so I think these data here with this 1% causing 35%, 36% of the problems gives you a sense of the types of interactions that correctional clients who are in custody and who are hopefully going to rehabilitate and be released and not come back, the struggles that they have dealing with some of these more extreme offenders. Not all of my cases that I have consulted on have involved these sort of textbook career offenders who are profoundly psychopathic. Some of them have involved what we might call in sociology normal homicides, so to speak, that arise out of family disputes, intimate partner dynamics, and much more internalizing features where the murder and the aggression leading up to it is really, frankly, out of character compared to the rest of their life history. And so it's interesting to me as a criminologist to work these cases. One of the things I tell audiences that I really love about consulting is how much you learn and how much it allows you to really start to, in granular fashion, delve into some of these typologies of homicide offenders, delve into some of these psychological constructs that we know have significant linkages to aggression, and thinking about the ways that these unique cases might cause us to maybe alter our theoretical ideas in some ways, or to see combinations that might not be in the textbook, so to speak, or in the journals, but are nevertheless manifesting in real world cases. Some attorneys have stated to me, both from the prosecution and the defense side, that to them, the most appropriate death cases are those where a monstrous offender perpetrated a monstrous murder. And in cases where you don't have a monstrous offender, but someone who is reflecting the characteristics that are on the slide, interestingly, both prosecution and defense are often very keen on getting pleas to life sentences because the ultimate sanction seems inappropriate. And it also, just from my perspective, isn't matching the extremity that you would see in some of the individuals who I've described. The NHI there is from a brilliant book called The Black Hand, which is about a man named Rene Enriquez, who was a very high-level member of the Mexican mafia and then renounced his gang involvement and has since become a sort of an expert witness about gang dynamics. And in that book, he talked about that they don't view the violence that they're perpetrating, the aggressive acts, whether it's assaults, robberies, rapes, murders, they don't view them as crimes because to them, no humans are involved. they draw these hard lines where anyone involved in criminal activity and anyone involved in the gang world is appropriate for aggression. And although they certainly victimize people who are not antisocial or not in gangs, I have been surprised with how many of them draw these fundamental distinctions between significant offenders and people who do not get into trouble with the law. And one of the things that I do kind of to cultivate theoretical ideas is I'll ask some of these individuals who have these decades-long offending histories about antisociality. What are the factors that they think contribute to it? What are the characteristics of it that they find relevant? Can they tell by looking at another person if they're antisocial or if they have antisocial potential? And the quotation there is one of the interviewees I talked to who was significantly psychopathic, but he was also had a high level of internalizing features. He was highly depressive and really was quite vulnerable during our interview, and was remarkably honest with me, and was remarkably troubled. He was under the influence of methamphetamine during our interview, and his supervision was revoked a week or two after I interviewed him. But one of the things that he said to me is midway point during the interview, I said, how can you tell if I'm antisocial or am I antisocial? And he said, the first thing I did when I sat down is I looked at your face, your neck, and your hands, and I didn't see scarring, so I can tell you haven't been doing this. I can tell that you're good people. And he said, you talk really well, which I took as a compliment. But he just instantaneously made that assessment that I was not someone like him, that I was not in this no humans involved type of world. That didn't necessarily mean that he would not victimize me if he felt it was necessary. But it is interesting that these normative assessments are made by offenders about themselves and about people who they view as not really being in that world. In the last couple of years, we can never have enough typologies in the field. And so I created a new type of offender who I dubbed super homicide offenders. And these are individuals who have 5 or more murder convictions, and which places them in homicide data in about the 95th percentile of homicide perpetration. And I drew these data from a very large data set of condemned prisoners in the state of California. So I had data on 636 of these individuals, and 39 of them were these super homicide offenders. What I was wanting to do was to create a parsimonious construct that could transcend some of the existing typologies we have in homicide studies. And as you'll see below, there's probably some value in that because some of these individuals over the course of their offending career will demonstrate different types of homicide perpetration that are meeting the criteria for multiple typologies. The super homicide offenders tended to have much more significant offending histories. And one of the points that's interesting about that, and I think profound about that, is they do spend a ton of time in custody and accumulate dozens of arrests and of placements in jail and prison, but also nevertheless are able to accumulate 5 or more homicide convictions. So it gives you a sense of the velocity with which they are killing when they are in the community and or in correctional settings. These individuals have high levels of externalizing features, especially ASPD and conduct disorder, high levels of psychopathy, sexual sadism, depressive disorders, and also cluster A and B personality disorders. Of those 39, roughly half of them are psychopathic in the sense that they're 30 or higher on the PCLR, but 62% of them met criteria for multiple typologies. And so one of the bigger conclusions I want audiences to draw from this is when we have a typology, which is just simply a way to organize information and to organize data, those typologies have significant value. In this homicide case, serial, spree, sexual, mass, those are valuable typologies. But when you are in the extremes of offending, you might be dealing with an individual who is engaged in different types of these across their offending career. And so how do you classify them in a more accurate way? And can we produce studies articulating this very extreme group to better inform both supervision and prevention to the degree that we can do that with antisocial behavior at this level? With the California data in particular, one of the unique features is I was interested in the dark figure of murder. So the dark figure of crime is this notion that what you see in an individual's official criminal record is a reasonable proxy of their antisocial history, but it is a gross minimization of their offending history. And I have had individuals tell me during forensic interviews on this issue of criminal history who will look at me and just say, the records you have here are nothing compared to what I've actually done. Even with homicides, they're very cagey about dates and about specifics of them because the statute of limitations doesn't exist. But a large number of serious offenders have this dark figure of murders where there's additional victims out there that they're not aware of. And so in the California data, we used a kind of a broad definition of dark figure. So it could be both unknown cases, but also ones that where there's some suggestive evidence where they just simply weren't prosecuted for a variety of reasons. And about 1/3 of them had a dark figure of murder. So that's comforting in a variety of ways. About 2/3 of murderers who are condemned, the murders victims that we know of that they were convicted of are the only ones. There's no evidence anywhere else that they have additional ones. And of those who do have additional homicide victims, for most, it's going to be 1 or 2. It's basically a negative binomial distribution. But what you can see is that at the very tail of these individuals who have double digit to dozens of additional victims, they have a variety of features which set them apart forensically from less prolific types of homicide offenders. And just to give you a national context, in the United States, there's about 350,000 unsolved murders going back to roughly 1965. And in earlier eras of American history, that was primarily because of poor surveillance, rather primitive criminal justice systems, poor record keeping in the area of fingerprinting, and non-existent DNA analysis. Today, the relatively low clearance rate for homicides and the high number of unsolved murders is primarily due to low cooperation with law enforcement. So it's really shifted in terms of its qualitative nature. But as a social problem, to me, this dark figure of murder is one that is still off the radar of criminologists and should receive much more attention than it gets. Among those outliers, and you could argue that everything I've talked about today are outliers, those very hyper-prolific offenders, almost all are profoundly psychopathic, profoundly sexually sadistic, and also usually necrophilic. And so these are the type of individuals who accumulate those massive totals of homicide convictions. And one example would be, for instance, Gary Ridgway in Washington State, who pled guilty to 49 counts of aggravated murder, but who has suggested that his actual number of homicides is many more than that. And indeed, most of the very significant, highly prolific homicide offenders, especially sexual homicide offenders, there's usually significant evidence that they have many more victims that they won't reveal. In the last few years, in an effort to try and be like Tracy and be a big-time author, I've started to import my forensic and criminological research interest and connect it with the true crime genre about which I am a fan. And so I am a lifelong criminal justice enthusiast and a lifelong true crime reader in particular. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work that we can do with using scholarship and science to shed light on some of these popular topics that maybe academia has historically thumbed its nose at. And so I think in terms of my own career, I'll continue to do the publishing and the research and the teaching, But I find that my students in particular really like incorporating scholarly research on aggression at the highest levels and seeing how it plays out in some of these infamous cases of offenders in the United States. And just to kind of give you an example of that, the last 3 books that I've done over the last few years, the Bundy book was the first, and that was really a couching Ted Bundy's offending career in this broader nexus of the unsolved murder epidemic in the United States. And the Bundy book doesn't just discuss him, but also Rodney Alcala, who was death sentenced in California, Samuel Little, who towards the end of his life developed a very good rapport with a Texas Ranger and confessed to 93 murders. He died 5 years ago. And then also some other offenders who illustrate different kinds of criminological topics pertaining to multiple homicide offending. And so I kind of revisit Bundy's life, in particular the decade from his high school graduation in 1965 to his official start of his murder career in 1974. And I suggest that there was likely a profound amount of homicide perpetration during that time and provide a fair amount of evidence to support that. The middle book, What DNA Evidence Reveals About Criminals, Cold Case Criminology, over the years, I would find current events to use in class as a conversation starter at the beginning of lecture. And I found that I was compiling, frankly, dozens of these cases where an individual who was either deceased or was on death row somewhere or serving life imprisonment somewhere, or who was in the community somewhere, had been linked by DNA evidence to usually a sexual homicide or a sexual assault from decades earlier. And these cases, themes started to emerge. And so this book is really, again, using some of those real world cold cases that get resolved with DNA evidence in showing the criminological features of those individuals. And so it was really doing the Bundy book and giving me a sense of the tragedy of these unsolved murders. And so the middle book, Cold Case Criminology, really kind of runs with that. The last one, my most recent book, True Crime America, The Functions of Our Murder Obsession, I provide the intellectual and scientific reasons for why true crime is such a popular sociocultural genre. Even talking about something known as sensationalism dating back several centuries, where the public interest in severe crime and profound or extreme aggression is timeless, as is the differential response to people who have interest in this subject matter. And so a lot of the gamesmanship and the academic or elite condescension about true crime is as old as time. And so I also talk about the Bundy book and what that meant for my career and the public reaction to it, which frankly dwarfed the reaction to everything in my career previous. And so I talk about how that cultural force is an important, interesting thing, and that there's a reason why so many people listen to podcasts about true crime. There's a reason why so much streamed content is about true crime. There's a reason why a significant amount of the book market is about that subject matter. In the end, one of the kind of the imagery I like to use is the light and the darkness. And in studying people who are profoundly antisocial and highly aggressive and violent, one of the points that I always take from it is that most people aren't, that most people are good, that most people are nonviolent, that most people understand aggression is destructive. And that one of the reasons why these subject matters are so interesting is because it's so novel relative to their daily functioning. And so I find studying the extremes of criminal behavior to be affirming of the broader universe of people who are what I call the wonderful people. The other thing that's interesting is even when I'm talking to people who have been reprehensible criminals throughout their career, a forensic interview will reveal their humanity. And so it's not something you can necessarily prepare for or expect. But some of these interviews have had moments of levity, moments of humor, points where they were frankly very endearing. And there have been moments where it was clear to me that this person would think nothing of killing me if the context were different. And so that is a very fascinating, surreal experience to have as an interviewer. Thank you for listening to my talk about extreme aggression, and I look forward to your comments and questions.